The alert came before I had time to blink. 1 second, I was staring at a half-eaten protein bar on my console, and the next, every screen on Lunar Command exploded into red. Not the soft amber of a drill. Red. The kind that made your stomach drop straight through the floor and kept going. "Signal confirmed," said Lieutenant Cara Nolan from the seat beside me, her voice completely flat. "It is not a drill." I pulled up the raw feed. "My name is Cale Morrow. I am 26 years old. I am a signals and translation officer, which means I spend most of my days decoding data packet from deep space relay buoys and writing reports that perhaps a dozen people will ever read. I am not a soldier. I have never fired a weapon outside a training range. I graduated at the top of my class in linguistic analysis and at the very bottom of my class in physical endurance testing, a fact my colleagues never let me forget. The most dramatic thing that had happened to me in 3 years of service was a coffee machine that caught fire in the break room and briefly evacuated 12 people into the corridor in their socks. That morning changed everything. The message was on every open frequency simultaneously. It was not encrypted. Whatever had sent it wanted to be heard by everyone without exception, and it was. Every ship, every station, every relay point within 40 light minutes of Earth picked it up at the same moment. The translation software took 4 seconds to process it, which was strange because our software was extremely fast, trained on 17 alien language systems, and able to render basic communication in under a second on most days. When the words appeared on my screen, I understood why it had taken the extra time. The software had tried twice to find a polite version. There was not one. The message read, "You have committed an act of aggression against the Veth Collective and its sovereign territories. You will stand down all vessels, surrender all claims beyond your home system, and accept a period of supervised restriction lasting no fewer than 100 of your solar cycles. Failure to comply within 72 hours will result in total species pacification." This is not a negotiation. This is a courtesy. I read it 3 times. Then I read it a 4th time because I was certain I had misread a word somewhere. Words like supervised restriction and species pacification did not appear in normal diplomatic communication. They were not the kind of words that got sent to an entire civilization on an open channel unless someone was extremely angry or extremely confident. Based on everything we knew about the Veth Collective, I suspected both. I had not made a mistake. Commander Petrolane was standing behind me before I had finished the 4th read. She was my commanding officer, a woman who had spent 20 years in deep space operations and who had a scar along her jaw that she never explained and which no one on the base had ever worked up the courage to ask about directly. She read the message over my shoulder in complete silence for a long moment. Then she laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not the kind you produce when something is so overwhelming you have no other option. A real, full, and genuinely amused laugh. The kind that came from somewhere deep. She pulled out the chair next to mine, sat down heavily, and rubbed her face with both hands, still smiling. "Morrow," she said, "pull up everything we have on the Veth Collective." I pulled it up. The file was much thinner than I would have liked, given the circumstances. We had made first contact with the Veth only 11 months ago. They were one species within a larger body called the Collective, a formal political and military alliance of 7 distinct civilizations spread across a cluster of star systems roughly 400 light-years from Earth. They were technologically advanced by our current standards. They were old as civilizations measure time. They had infrastructure we could not fully map and communication networks that operated on principles our physicists were still working to understand. And up until approximately 72 hours ago, they had considered humanity an interesting but unremarkable discovery. Like finding a new type of insect in a garden you thought you already knew completely. Our threat assessment of the Veth was classified at a reasonable level and based on solid observation. But the Veth's threat assessment of us was something I had pulled up only once before, as pure curiosity late one night during an especially boring shift, and I had almost immediately set it aside because it read more like a politely written misunderstanding than actual intelligence work. They had rated humanity a Class 2 nuisance. Class 2. The Veth Collective threat scale ran from Class 1, described as negligible, no action required, all the way up to Class 9, which their own documentation defined simply as existential. The middle ranges described things like organized resistance, technological unpredictability, and capacity for rapid expansion. Class 2 was near the bottom of the entire scale. The detailed description for it read, low capability species displaying limited territorial reach and minimal defensive organization. Monitor at irregular intervals. I had also learned, during a slow research afternoon, that the collective had given the same Class 2 rating to a species of enormous migratory creatures that traveled between star systems and occasionally bumped into unmanned survey probes hard enough to damage them. They thought we were roughly as dangerous as very large, confused animals. What actually happened? I asked Petra. The incident they mentioned. What was it specifically? She pulled up a separate report, a field incident summary filed 3 days earlier, and dropped it on my screen. A mining crew, 14 people aboard a heavy excavation vessel called the Carver, operating in a debris-rich region of space that the extraction company had labeled Sector 9 because it was the ninth sector they had cataloged, and no one in the company had ever felt the need for more creative naming conventions. Standard operation, standard equipment, routine survey, routine extraction plan. They had identified a large rock formation with unusual mineral density readings, which meant profitable yields, and they had done what miners do when they find something worth digging into. They had detonated it. Unfortunately, and in a way that no one in the company, the government, or any of our diplomatic offices had known to warn against, the rock formation was not a rock formation. It was a Veth monument. Something ancient, something that held significance across all 7 species of the collective, that had stood in that region of space for over 300 years, and that every spacefaring civilization within the collective sphere of influence had known about, visited, and treated with the kind of quiet reverence most humans reserve for very old cathedrals or memorials to the fallen. Nobody had told us. Not because it was a secret, but because the Veth had assumed, with the confident logic of a civilization that had never encountered a spacefaring species that did not already know about it, that anyone capable of reaching that region would already be aware. The same way you might assume a first-time visitor to a major city would know instinctively not to spray paint the walls of the National Museum. The Carver crew had not known. They had detonated the monument with cheerful industrial efficiency and then filed a routine extraction report before anyone on either side had processed what had happened. By the time the diplomatic channels lit up, the collective had already voted. The vote, I later learned from Sirith, had not been close. 72 hours, said Petra, leaning back in her chair and looking at the ceiling with that same expression, still halfway between amused and something I could not yet name. They gave us 72 hours. What do we do? I asked. She looked at me. Her expression was not afraid. I examined it carefully because I was afraid, and I wanted to understand why she was not, and I thought that if I could identify what was in her face, I might be able to borrow some of it for myself. Later, when I had a great deal more time to think about that morning, I decided what I saw was patience. The specific kind that belongs to someone who has been in enough bad situations to understand, from long experience, how they tend to resolve. We do what humans always do, she said. By the time we talk, we stay calm, and in the meantime, we get ready. What followed in the next 3 hours was unlike anything I had experienced in my career. Every command channel in the solar system activated at once. Earth's combined defense councils, which under normal circumstances moved with the speed and efficiency of a very large ship trying to turn in a very small harbor, were convened within 40 minutes of the message arriving. Every nation with a meaningful presence in space was on the same call. Ambassadors, generals, fleet admirals, heads of scientific agencies, senior intelligence officers from 6 different continents. People who had not spoken to each other in months were suddenly sharing the same secure channel, talking over each other in 17 languages while my software worked through the night. I sat at my console and I listened and translated and flagged the useful signals from the enormous amount of noise. The Veth Collective sent a second message at hour 4. It was shorter. It said, "Your silence is noted." The clock continues. At hour 6, a Veth fleet of unknown size crossed what they considered the boundary of their sovereign space and began moving toward our system. Our long-range sensors picked them up immediately. The sensor team, led by a young officer named Colin Webb who had been on shift for 14 hours without complaint, spent 20 minutes carefully counting what they saw. Then they spent another 20 minutes counting again because the first number did not seem possible. When Colin reported to Petra, his voice was professionally steady in the way that requires deliberate effort. His hands were not steady. I could see them from across the room. Petra took the number without reacting. Then she turned to me. "Morrow," she said quietly, "I need you to pull up Earth's complete military history database. All conflicts, all engagements, every recorded instance of organized human warfare, going back to the earliest available records." I looked at her. "That is going to take a moment to compile," I said. "There is a great deal of it." She nodded once. "I know," she said. "That is exactly the point." I ran the query. While the database compiled, I watched the Veth fleet on the tactical display. Enormous shapes moving through the dark with the quiet confidence of something that had done this before many times and found it easy every time. The collective had engaged in 63 military conflicts in its recorded history. It had won 63. It had never once encountered a species that came back a second time and required a 64th. The database finished compiling. The number that appeared at the top of my screen, representing every recorded human conflict, large and small going back to written record, was large enough that I looked at it twice to make sure I had not read an extra digit somewhere. I had not. Petra leaned over and looked at it too. Then she did something I had not expected. She picked up her direct line to the Senior Military Council, and when the channel opened, she gave them a single order. "Activate everything," she said. "Not some of it, not the standing protocols. Everything, across the solar system, in stations and bases and ships that had been sitting in reserve without fanfare for years." Lights began coming on. Activation confirmations rolled across my board in a long, steady chain of green, moving outward from Earth like a slow wave, reaching the edges of every direction we had ever sent anything. Colin Webb looked over at me from his station. He was 23 years old and had a little brother back on Earth. He had mentioned this brother to me once in the break room, in the easy way people mention things they love when they are comfortable, and the detail had lodged somewhere in my memory without my choosing. "Morrow," he said very quietly in the gap between two transmission bursts, "are we going to be okay?" I looked at the green lights continuing to roll across my board. I thought about the number in the database. I thought about Petra's laugh. "Yes," I said, "I think we're going to be fine." I was not fully certain of that yet, but the certainty was building, and it felt like it was built on something solid rather than something I had simply chosen to believe. The Veth hit us at hour 41. They did not wait for the 72-hour deadline to expire. That was the first thing their commanders did that surprised our staff, and it mattered because it meant they were operating on a timeline driven by confidence rather than procedure. They expected the operation to be over quickly. They wanted momentum, so they did not wait. The opening strike was an electromagnetic pulse coordinated across 3 separate vectors simultaneously, designed to knock out our long-range communications grid and leave our outer defense stations isolated and effectively blind before the main fleet arrived. It was a clean, precise, and technically sophisticated piece of military planning. Every analyst who reviewed it afterward agreed on those exact words. It worked for 71 hours. Then our engineers, operating in round-the-clock rotating shifts and consuming quantities of coffee that I strongly suspect will eventually appear in medical literature, rebuilt the communications grid using a completely different underlying architecture. They did not simply repair the damaged components. They replaced the entire system with something new, built from parts sourced from 4 different stations, 2 decommissioned survey ships, and what Lieutenant Cara Nolan's official after-action report described with admirable precision as creative problem-solving that technically violated 17 safety regulations but produced a functional result. I was at my console when the new grid came online. The cheer that went through the operations floor was loud enough that the station's structural impact sensors briefly logged it as a minor collision event. That was the moment I truly began to understand what Petra had been trying to show me. She was standing at the central display when I found her watching the tactical map. The Veth fleet's advance had slowed to nearly nothing. Their commanders had moved into position expecting to find us fragmented and silent, unable to coordinate. Instead, they found every human installation in the outer system talking to each other with perfect clarity, operating through a communications framework they had never encountered and could not immediately identify. how to disrupt. They are confused, Petrus said, without looking away from the display. Yes, I said. Their advanced formation has been in holding position for 6 hours. She nodded. Good. Confusion cost them time. Lost time cost them momentum. And the one thing you never, ever want to give humans is time to think. I had been compiling field reports for 3 days straight by that point, reading every dispatch that came in from our deployed units, and I had started seeing a pattern that I found genuinely difficult to categorize. Our forces were not fighting the way any textbook of conventional military doctrine described. They were not holding lines, not executing the coordinated defensive withdrawals that the situation theoretically called for, not doing any of the things that the Veth's own tactical modeling would have predicted. They were doing something much harder to prepare for. At Forward Station Kelvin, when Veth ground forces landed expecting to find a crew demoralized and ready to surrender, they found an empty base. Every human crew member had evacuated before the landing. They had taken everything portable with them, and what they had left behind was the structural elements that could not easily be moved, except that some of those structural elements had been very recently and very quietly modified. The Veth forces spent 11 hours conducting thorough safety scans before advancing into the station, because they knew human forces well enough by day to expect something unexpected. When their sensors showed no threats, they moved in. At that point, they discovered that certain things had been recently bolted to the walls, and the bolting had been done with a specific purpose. The station came apart at several key points simultaneously. No one in the Veth force was critically hurt. That was not an accident. The human unit responsible, led by a sergeant named Diane Cross, had calibrated it to disrupt and delay rather than cause lasting damage. Not out of any particular mercy, though the outcome was not cruel, but because a disrupted and confused enemy is more strategically useful than a badly hurt one who becomes unpredictable. By the time the Veth forces reorganized at Kelvin, the human crew was 11 kilometers away in a position the Veth advance teams had already swept and marked as clear 2 days earlier. The Veth field commander at Kelvin filed a report afterward. I translated it personally. He described the human behavior throughout the engagement as, and I worked very carefully to get this translation right, tactically irrational and therefore impossible to model reliably. He requested updated guidance from his command structure on how to engage forces that consistently acted outside expected parameters. His superiors did not have any. I began keeping a private log of the specific words and phrases the Veth field commanders used in their internal communications, because I found them worth tracking as their own kind of record. The collection that built up over the first week of the conflict included irrational persistence, resource indifference, self-defeating tactical choices, incomprehensible tolerance for adverse conditions, and one phrase that took me a full day and 3 dictionaries to render accurately into English because it had no direct equivalent in any human language I was aware of. The closest I could manage was an enemy that does not recognize when it has already been defeated. That particular phrase stayed with me in a way the others did not. War Master Cirith arrived at Lunar Command on day 4. He had not been traveling as a prisoner in any formal sense. He was aboard a Veth diplomatic vessel that had tried to cross through our outer defense zone, presumably to open a back channel before things escalated further, and had been intercepted when its access codes turned out to be 3 days out of date. Our system had rotated credentials on day 1 as a standard precaution, and nobody on the diplomatic vessel had been updated. The officer who intercepted the ship was Owen Hartley, a pilot who flew a single-seat scout vessel about 1/8 the mass of the Veth diplomatic ship. Owen's solution to the interception problem was to fly his craft directly in front of the diplomatic vessel's primary navigation viewport and remain there, matching speed and course perfectly, until the larger ship slowed to a stop. It was not a technique covered in any training document I had ever read. It was the kind of solution that came from someone who looked at the tools immediately available to them and worked backward from the result they needed. It worked completely. Cirith was escorted to Lunar Command on Petra's direct authorization. She did not want him detained formally or made uncomfortable. She wanted him observed by someone who could actually understand what he said. She placed him in a well-appointed observation room with access to general news and information feeds, and she assigned me to sit with him because my fluency in his language extended well beyond what the translation software could manage. He was older than I expected. In human terms, I might have estimated somewhere in his late 50s or early 60s, though that comparison was probably meaningless given my complete ignorance of a species' lifespan. He was calm in a way that felt like a choice rather than a natural state, as though calm was a discipline he practiced rather than a personality trait he simply had. He did not immediately demand to contact his government. He did not request formal prisoner status or challenge his situation. He sat across the table from me and watched the news feeds with an expression I could not entirely decode. And on the first day, he asked only one question. How many wars has your species fought? I had the database result available. I had been looking at the number often enough by that point that it had become part of my daily thinking. I told him the number. He did not speak again for 2 full days. I brought him meals and sat across from him during the hours I was assigned to the observation room, and he mostly read. He pulled up historical databases, not military ones, but political and cultural ones. Maps of human civilization across time. Population movements. The rise and collapse of governing structures. The slow and violent and sometimes extraordinary record of what humans had built on a single planet before they managed to reach beyond it. On the morning of day 6, I came in with his breakfast and found him staring at a map that covered 12,000 years of human territorial changes, borders constantly shifting, civilizations folding into each other and splitting apart, cities built on the ruins of previous cities. The collective, he said, without looking up from the map, has fought 63 military engagements. I know, I said. We won all 63. I know that as well. He finally looked at me. His expression had shifted from what I had seen in the first days. It was quieter now, more careful, the expression of someone who had processed a large amount of information and was still working through the implications. The species we defeated, he said slowly, they came at us with their strongest capacity from the beginning. First contact, first conflict, maximum effort immediately. I nodded because I understood where the observation was going. Your forces, he said, are doing the opposite. Every day, the response is different from the day before. Every position we take creates new problems we were not given tools to handle. And everything we have seen so far suggests you are still holding back. Yes, I said. He was quiet for a long moment. How long has your species been doing this? He said. Surviving things that should have ended you. As long as we have existed, I said. It is the only way we know. He looked back at the map and did not reply. Out in the main operations room, the Veth fleet had resumed its advance after the pause following the new grid coming online. But the advance was slower now and tighter, the formation compressed in a way that communicated something clearly to anyone who knew what they were looking at. You tighten a formation when the space around you has stopped feeling safe. You pull your forces close when the environment has begun to seem like it might have things in it that your sensors have not yet found. There were quite a lot of things in the space around them that their sensors had not yet found. Petra had spent the first week of the conflict moving assets into positions that the Veth sensor sweeps consistently failed to identify, not because our technology had somehow outpaced theirs in the space of a week, but because our people had an extraordinary working knowledge of every rock, debris field, gravitational shadow, and electromagnetic anomaly in this part of space, accumulated over decades of mining, surveying, and simply living here. The Veth were operating in a system they had assessed from a distance. Our people had grown up in it. There is a significant difference between knowing a place on a map and knowing it, because you have repaired equipment in its shadow and eaten lunch looking at its surface and navigated its currents for half your working life. The Veth were hunting in a space our people knew better than any place in the universe, and they were being watched very carefully from places they had not thought to look. On day 8, 3 of the 7 member species of the collective issued a joint statement of formal military support for the Veth action, adding their own assets to the campaign. The coalition the collective assembled in response was, by any measure we could apply, the largest concentrated military force they had ever directed toward a single conflict. When the intelligence reached our command channels, it produced a moment of genuine silence across the operations floor, the kind where everyone is doing the same mental arithmetic at the same time and arriving at the same large number. Then, from somewhere near the back of the room, a voice I never conclusively identified said, quietly. Good. Now we only have to do this once. A few people laughed. Then more people. Petra did not laugh. She studied the updated projections with the same patient expression and then connected to the military council channel and gave a second order. This one referenced a ship designation I had to search in the classified registry because I had not encountered it before. The ships it referenced had been constructed over 8 years. They had not appeared in any public defense allocation. They had been built for one purpose, precisely described in a single classified document that Petra authorized me to read that afternoon, sitting quietly at my console while the green confirmation signals began rolling in. I read the document. Then I closed it. Then I sat very still for a few minutes thinking about what it meant that humans had spent 8 years building things like that and not told anyone they were doing it. Owen Hartley, who had pulled up a chair next to my station on day 4 and had been sitting there most of the time since, looked at my face. "What is it?" he asked. "Those ships they just activated," I said. "What about them?" "They have been sitting out there for 8 years," I said. "Just waiting." Owen was quiet for a moment. "Waiting for what?" he asked. I looked at the tactical display. "For someone to make the kind of mistake the Veth just made," I said. Owen absorbed that. He looked at the new activation confirmations populating the board. He let out a very slow breath. "Morrow," he said, "did anyone know those existed before today?" "The people who built them," I said, "and whoever signed the budget for them, and nobody else." He looked at the display for a long moment. "I'm trying to decide how I feel about that." "Let me know when you work it out," I said. "I'm trying to figure out the same thing." The Veth fleet's advance on the tactical screen slowed to a stop for the second time in 8 days, as their long-range sensors registered the new ships coming out of the dark at the edges of the system. Their commanders would be counting right now. They would need to recount. I knew because I had watched Colin Webb's hands when he was counting them. Sirith knocked on the observation room door, and I went to open it. He stood in the doorway, looking past me at the main display. "They have stopped again," he said. "Yes." He studied the display for a moment. "War Masterkin will interpret this as a trap," he said. "He will spend time trying to identify the mechanism. He will not consider the possibility that what he is seeing is simply true." "What would he be seeing that is simply true?" I asked. Sirith turned to look at me steadily. "That you were never showing us everything you had," he said. "That you never do." He went back inside, and I closed the door and returned to my console and spent a long time watching the Veth fleet sit motionless in the dark, trying to decide what kind of enemy they were dealing with. Can's command ship had been transmitting at higher than normal frequency for 6 hours. I was tracking the communications as they came in and comparing them to the patterns from previous days. On day 1, his transmissions had been brief and confident. The kind of communications you send when you do not expect to need many words because events are proceeding as planned. On day 8, they had become longer. On day 12, they had become more frequent. Now, on day 15, they had become both longer and more frequent simultaneously, which in any command structure signals exactly one thing. The person sending them no longer has the situation fully in hand. Colin Webb appeared at my shoulder without announcing himself, the way he had taken to doing when something on the sensor board felt important enough to share in person rather than by channel. He was holding a tablet with a fresh sensor reading on it. "They changed formation again," he said, keeping his voice low in the way people do in large rooms when the news is significant. I looked at the reading. The Veth fleet had tightened its configuration further, pulling its outer elements inward. It was the 3rd time in 2 days. Every time they compressed the formation, the logic was the same. Reduce the perimeter, protect the core, deal with the uncertainty at the edges by making the edges smaller. The problem with that logic, in this particular system, was that making their perimeter smaller did not reduce the number of things in the surrounding space that they could not identify. It only reduced the area over which they were distributed while those things remained where they were. "What does that do to their supply routing?" I asked. Colin pulled up a secondary display. "It cuts their resupply efficiency by about 1/3, he said. "They would need to reorganize their logistics chain to compensate." "How long would that take?" "Given what we know about their standard protocols, 3 to 4 days minimum," he said. 3 to 4 days. During which time they would be operating at reduced efficiency, drawing down reserves, holding a tighter position than was comfortable, and watching a fleet of ships they had not known existed sitting in the dark at the edges of their sensor range. They're going to have to make a decision soon, I said. Yes, Collins said. He looked at the display for another moment. Moro, do you think they know yet? What they're actually dealing with? I thought about Siritha's words through the door. That you were never showing us everything you had. That you never do. No, I said. Not yet. But they're getting close. I could have told them. The answer was simple enough. But I was not sure they were ready to hear simple answers yet. And besides, they were about to find out on their own terms. The Battle of Kepler Station happened on day 11, and I watched every second of it from the central display at Lunar Command, reading the data stream as fast as it came in and filling gaps with communications from the field that I was pulling off the live channel. Kepler Station was not a military installation. That point matters, and I want to be clear about it. It was a research and resupply outpost positioned at the edge of what our navigation charts call the mid-system zone, staffed by 43 people. Geologists, atmospheric scientists, a structural engineering team, 2 medical officers, and a security complement of 12 people under the command of Sergeant Diane Cross. Diane was 31 years old, had grown up in a city called Bristol on Earth's western coast, and had, according to her service record, a distinguished history of remaining calm when everything around her was not, and being very vocal about everything when it was. The VETH selected Kepler as a strategic target because it sat at the junction of 2 primary supply corridors. Control Kepler, and you split our logistics in half. It was sound tactical reasoning. On paper, with their force numbers against our security complement, it should have been a brief and uncomplicated operation. What Diane Cross had been doing with the 4 days since the VETH advance began was not on any paper the VETH had access to. She had turned Kepler Station into an entirely different place. Every internal corridor had been altered. Not demolished, not obviously damaged, but changed in ways that were subtle and consistent and deeply inconvenient for anyone who had not been living there. Access panels had been relocated. The gravity plating in 3 sections of the station had been manually decoupled from the central control system and rewired to a handheld unit that Diane carried personally. The station's internal lighting network had been reconfigured with the same logic, so Diane could change illumination in any section of the station from her pocket without touching a wall control. The ventilation system had been rebuilt to route air through different pathways than the original schematics showed, which meant that the biological tracking sensors the VETH used to locate warm bodies in enclosed spaces were pulling heat signatures from corridors that held nothing but redirected airflow. The VETH landed 43 soldiers to match our complement numbers. They entered the station with standard search protocols, systematic, methodical, beginning at the outer sections and moving inward. They expected to find a frightened civilian crew attempting to hide. They found an empty station that smelled like people had been there recently and a layout that did not match their schematics in ways that were just different enough to be consistently wrong. Diane Cross spent those 6 hours doing nothing heroic in the conventional sense. She moved her crew steadily, section by section, always to spaces the VETH had already swept and logged as clear, using her knowledge of every centimeter of Kepler to put walls and airlocks between her people and the search. She gave no dramatic orders. She did not raise her voice. She moved 43 non-military personnel through a station full of armed soldiers looking specifically for them, and she did it without once being seen. When her crew reached the docking ring, they boarded 2 emergency transit pods and released from the station. Then Diane Cross, from a distance of 3 kilometers, turned the gravity plating off. Not in one section. Everywhere. All at once, simultaneously, across every corridor and chamber in service bay. 43 VETH soldiers in full gear, distributed through multiple levels of the station, were suddenly and completely without weight. No warning. No transition. One moment standard gravity, the next moment none at all. In enclosed corridors with no handholds immediately within reach. In armor that added mass without adding mobility. With no surface to push from and nothing to grab in the half-second before instinct kicked in, the formation that VETH military training had spent years building simply came apart. It lasted 40 seconds. Then Diane restored gravity. The after-action report described the results as non-lethal but comprehensively effective. The VETH soldiers were physically intact, but their formation had dissolved completely. Their positioning was wrong. Their communication channels had been disrupted by the sudden chaos, and their tactical plan had stopped functioning at the point where it most needed to be coherent. By the time any of them had reorganized sufficiently to resume the operation, Diane's crew was 4 kilometers away and transmitting on a frequency the Veth had not yet identified. When the full report reached Lunar Command, Petra read every line of it twice. She did not laugh this time. She read it with focused attention and then looked at me. She used gravity, Petra said. Yes, I said. As a weapon, as a disruptive tool. I said because that felt accurate. No one was harmed. Petra was quiet for a long moment. Pull up her service record. I want her promoted before the end of the shift. I pulled up the record and began the paperwork. While I worked, I kept one eye on the translation feed I had running from the Veth Command communications, because they had grown considerably less careful about encryption in the past 48 hours, possibly because they had not anticipated needing to be careful about it and had not built the habit. The word appearing most often in the field commander's communications now, in their reports to Can's command ship, was one I had not encountered in any pre-conflict briefing document. It was newly applied, which meant it was responsive to what they were actually experiencing rather than drawn from any existing playbook. The translation I arrived at after considerable work was unkillable, not invincible. That distinction is important. Invincible means you cannot be touched. Unkillable means you can be touched, hurt, knocked down, disrupted, driven back, and none of it produces the expected result because the thing you did it to simply comes back and keeps going. The engineering picture was changing too, and changing in a way that was making the Veth command staff increasingly uncomfortable based on the communications I was reading. Our people were not just repairing what the Veth's opening strikes had damaged. They were taking every piece of Veth technology they could access, studying it, running it through our labs, and building new things based on what they found. The speed of this process was alarming even to some of our own senior staff. Admiral Nadia Price, coordinating the engineering response from a base near Jupiter, sent a report to Lunar Command that included, near the bottom, the observation, "I have been in this field for 30 years, and I do not fully understand how they are doing this at the pace they are doing it." Petra read that line out loud and smiled for the first time in 3 days. "Necessity," she said. The word sat in the air for a moment. I turned it over in my mind and thought about everything I'd seen in 11 days. The rebuilt grid, Kepler station, the hidden ships, the database number. Necessity. It was not a complicated explanation. It was perhaps the most straightforward one available. Every wall humans had ever been placed against, they had eventually gone through, or over, or around. Not because they were universally clever or universally brave, but because stopping was genuinely not something the species had ever learned how to accept. Sirith requested to speak with me on day 13. He had been mostly quiet since day 6, spending long hours with the historical databases and the news feeds, filling in context for things he was observing in real time. I had made a habit of checking on him twice daily, bringing meals, and sitting with him for whatever time his disposition allowed. Partly because it was my assignment, and partly because I found his presence clarifying in an unexpected way. He was processing the same events I was processing from the opposite side of everything, and there was a particular kind of focus that came from being around someone who was genuinely surprised by what they were witnessing. On day 9, he had looked up from a historical database file about the reconstruction of a major human city following a conflict in our previous century and asked me a question I had not been ready for. Why do your people rebuild in the same location? I had not immediately understood what he meant. He elaborated. In every example he had studied of humans being driven from a place by destruction, the pattern was consistent. They returned not just to the general area, but to the specific ground. The same coordinates. They rebuilt on the ruins of what had been destroyed, often very quickly, as though the act of returning and rebuilding was itself the response. Is it sentiment? He asked. Attachment to a particular place? Or is it something with a different quality? I sat with the question honestly. Both of those things, I said eventually, but something else as well. I think it is a refusal to allow the worst thing that happened in a place to become the permanent definition of that place. He had looked at me for a long moment after that, very still, the way he got when something he had heard was going to take time to fully arrive. Then he went back to his files without speaking. On day 11, while the events at Kepler Station were still unfolding on the feeds, He had made one quiet observation without looking up from what he was reading. Your people fight as though the conflict itself is not the objective, he said. I had filed that observation and returned to it later, after I had read Diane Cross's full after-action report, and understood that he had identified something essential from the outside that I had been too close to see clearly. The goal at Kepler was not to defeat the Veth force in the station. The goal was to remove 43 people and deny the station's operational value, while preserving everything that could be preserved for whatever came next. The conflict was the environment the goal existed in, not the goal itself. When I came into the observation room and sat down on day 13, he was already at the table, hands folded, looking directly at me in a way he did not always do. I want to send a message to the collective council, he said. I looked at him steadily. You want to contact them? I want to warn them, he said. There is a difference. There was a difference. I had been thinking about it for several days. Actually, the possibility that Cirith might make exactly this request and what it would mean if he did. I was not his captor. He was not a formal prisoner. But what he was asking had implications that extended well beyond a simple communication. What do you want to tell them? I asked. He took a long, slow breath. I have spent 13 days watching your species respond to the worst military pressure the collective has applied to any species in its recorded history, he said. I have read 12,000 years of your recorded conflicts, your social collapses, your recoveries from things that should have been permanent ends. I have watched a crew of civilian scientists escape a military operation by turning gravity into a tactical tool. I have watched engineers rebuild a communications grid in 71 hours using parts from 6 different sources. I have watched a single pilot stop a diplomatic vessel 4 times his craft's mass by parking in its path and waiting. He paused. The council voted to pacify your species based on an assessment that rated you a Class 2 threat, he said. I want to tell them what class you actually are. I looked at him. What class is that? There is no existing classification, he said. The scale was built on species the collective had already encountered. Your species does not fit any of them. You would need a new category, and I suspect the category would need to be at the top of the scale. I sat with that for a moment. The implications of it were significant, and I did not want to treat them lightly. I will take the request up the chain, I said. I cannot make that call myself, but I will recommend approval. He nodded. He had not expected anything more than that, and he did not ask for it. I filed the request that evening with a personal note attached. I wrote that in my assessment as Senior Translation Officer, Cirith's communication could be of substantial value toward a diplomatic resolution and that I recommended it be permitted. I was not senior enough to authorize it. I was senior enough that my note would be read by someone who was. Petra read it. She approved it within 20 minutes. The message went out that night. I translated it myself, working slowly and carefully because the words mattered and I wanted them exact. Cirith had written it with the precision of a scientist presenting a finding he did not want misinterpreted. He described human history without dramatizing it. He described what he had observed with the same clinical accuracy he would have applied to any professional report. And at the very end, in a final sentence I took particular care with, he wrote, "You have declared war on a species that has been in conflict with something for the entirety of its existence, and you have done so under the belief that this would reduce them. You were wrong. It has not reduced them. It has reminded them of who they are." 3 members of the Collective Council requested direct communication with Earth's government within 48 hours of Cirith's message arriving. War Master Khan, who had not read the message and would not have adjusted his plans if he had, issued orders for the next phase of the advance. He was not the kind of commander who stepped back once committed. He was the kind who pressed forward and trusted that preparation and numbers would produce the result that history said they always produced. He was not wrong about the preparation. He was not wrong about the numbers. He was working with incomplete information about what numbers actually meant in this particular context. Owen Hartley came to find me the morning after Cirith's message went out. He sat down, handed me coffee, and looked at the tactical display for a long moment. "Ken is going to push," he said. "Yes," I said. "We are ready for that." I drank the coffee and looked at the display. "More than he knows," I said. Ken's push came that afternoon and lasted through the night and into the following morning. He sent his main force through the outer defense zone in a wide formation, fast and committed, the kind of coordinated advance that had ended 63 previous conflicts quickly and decisively. He was relying on everything the collective had learned in 300 years of military operations, and everything he had learned was correct in the context it had been learned in. Our forces met the advance the way water meets something solid. They moved, gave way, let the Veth push through, and then closed behind it. Not a new idea. Humans had employed versions of the same principle since before recorded history, under different names in different places and eras, but the underlying logic was always the same. Do not break against what you cannot hold, and let what is coming become the mechanism of its own difficulty. Ken spent 6 hours trying to understand what was happening to his formation. By the time he did, the situation had shifted twice more. The forward units he had positioned to hold his approach path were no longer where he had left them. They had not been pushed back. They had been redirected by a series of apparent opportunities that each led somewhere other than they appear to lead, because our unit commanders in that zone had a working knowledge of every gravitational pocket, every sensor shadow, every deceptive angle of approach in that region that no outside force operating for 2 weeks in a place we had lived in for decades could match. By the time Ken reestablished contact with his divided sections and began the process of reorganizing, his supply line had been cut by a formation that appeared, on his charts, to have materialized from nothing. It had not materialized from nothing. It had been sitting in a position his sweeps had marked as empty 17 days ago, and it had been sitting there quietly ever since, waiting for exactly the moment it could be most useful. Ken filed his report to the Collective Council that night. I translated every line of it personally. He did not use the word easy anywhere in the document. He had used it in his first 4 reports. It was absent now and never reappeared. Near the end, in a section that had the quality of something added after the main body was finished because the author had decided it was too significant to omit, Ken asked the Collective Council whether the original threat classification of humanity might benefit from formal review. I printed that paragraph. I folded it carefully and kept in my uniform pocket for the next 4 months. Not as a trophy, as a reminder of what the word review cost someone like Ken to write. Owen was quiet for a moment after I told him about the report. "Morrow," he said, "when this is over, what do you think happens?" I thought about it genuinely, not the quick answer, but the considered one. I thought about Sirith sitting with his map. I thought about Aerith's question. I thought about the green lights rolling across my board that first night. Something different than what either side planned for, I said. Something that probably does not have a name yet. Owen thought about that. Then he nodded once and turned back to his screens. The peace talks were held on a facility called the Velar Platform, built specifically for interspecies negotiations in a region of space formally belonging to neither party. Neutral ground in the practical sense, the kind of location chosen by people who understand that where you hold a conversation shapes what is said in it. Earth's delegation was 4 people. This was deliberate. Ambassador Lena Bradford led it. Bradford was 53 years old, had been in diplomatic service for most of her adult life, and had a reputation built on 2 specific qualities. She said less than people expected, and every word she did say carried more weight than anyone caught on the first hearing. She had chosen her 3 companions with the same precision she applied to everything else. Admiral Nadia Price sat to her right, representing the defense perspective, speaking rarely and listening with the focused quality of someone who would remember everything she heard. Dr. Owen Wakefield sat to her left, a researcher who had spent 2 decades studying the collective civilizations, and who was, in my assessment, the only human who had ever genuinely liked the Veth on a personal level, even through the conflict. And I sat at the end of the table. Cale Morrow, Signals and Translation Officer, 26 years old, present because Petra had signed my assignment orders herself without explanation beyond the note that she expected me not to waste the opportunity. The Veth delegation was 12 people. They arrived in formal attire that was structured and commanding by design, each garment holding its shape with a precision that made the wearers appear both composed and deliberate at all times. They arranged themselves on their side of the long table with the quiet efficiency of people who knew how this was supposed to go. They looked at our 4-person delegation and did not speak immediately. Each of them, in their own way and in their own time, registered the number. I was watching their faces because watching faces while other people watched words was what I did and I saw the moment understanding arrived. We had brought 4 people because 4 was sufficient. We were not there to demonstrate strength through numbers. The demonstration that mattered had already concluded. Counselor Vetherin led the Veth delegation. She was composed and measured and still in the way that Sirith was still, the deliberate stillness of someone managing something complex internally. She had a quality of attention that I respected immediately. She was listening to everything, not just the words being said, but the architecture of the room, the positioning of people, the things that were present and the things that were conspicuously absent. Before anyone had made an opening statement, she looked directly at me. Not at Bradford, not at Price. At me. "You are the translator," she said. "Yes," I said. "You have been present at Lunar Command since the beginning of this engagement." "From the first alert," I said. She studied me for a moment. "Then you have seen everything that occurred." "Most of it," I said, because honesty seemed more useful than impression management. "Not every detail. Enough to understand what happened." She nodded once and directed her attention to Bradford, and the formal proceedings opened. Bradford made an opening statement of 4 sentences. I know it was 4 because I counted while I listened, watching for exactly what she chose to include and what she calculated she did not need to say. She stated willingness to discuss a resolution. She acknowledged the original incident and confirmed it had been unintentional. She said that humanity's intention was to continue its exploration freely. And she added, in the same tone she had used for everything before it, that we expected to do exactly that. That 4th sentence changed the quality of the air in the room in a way that was not dramatic, but was definite. It was not aggressive. It carried no threat and no ultimatum. It was simply a statement of fact presented with the confidence of something that was simply true and therefore required no elaboration. Counselor Vetherin asked the question I had told Sirith she would ask. "What do your people want from this process?" Bradford did not pause. The mining rights in Sector 9 restored to their previous status. A formal acknowledgement entered into the permanent diplomatic record that the original incident was a misunderstanding rather than an act of aggression. And full freedom of movement for our vessels in all uncontested regions. The silence that followed was noticeable in length. The Veth delegates on either side of Vetherin exchanged looks that were careful and controlled, but readable if you were watching for them. Subdelegate Aerith was at the far end of the Veth side of the table, and she was, I'd already decided, the most interesting person in the room besides Bradford. She was young for her position, visibly attentive in ways that the more senior delegates had learned to mask, and she had not yet fully achieved the stillness the others maintained as a professional habit. She leaned very slightly forward. "That is all?" she asked. "That is all," Bradford said. Aerith looked at her colleagues and back. "No territorial claims? No formal reparations for losses your people sustained?" Bradford considered this for a single moment. "We would accept a formal apology," she said. "On the record." More silence. More exchanges of looks. Admiral Price had not spoken a word. She sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the Veth delegation with an expression that communicated, with no particular effort, that she had considerable things she could contribute and had chosen not to contribute them yet. The Veth delegates spoke among themselves in a register too low for the translation software to catch reliably. I caught fragments, enough to understand the shape of what they were feeling, which was not the outrage or calculation I might have expected, but something closer to a very large and unwelcome surprise. They had expected, I understood from those fragments, to be facing demands they would have to negotiate down from. They had prepared for a process of managing escalating requests, the conventional architecture of diplomatic resolution after a conflict in which one side had sustained the greater losses. They had not prepared for 4 requests, 3 of which were essentially practical, and 1 of which was something entirely different. During the first recess, I found Sirith in the corridor outside the chamber. He had been permitted to attend as an observer, a compromise that had taken considerable back-channel effort to arrange, and that everyone involved had agreed to treat as an informal situation without formal precedent. He fell in a step beside me without being asked. "She asked for an apology," he said. "Bradford." "Yes." She knew what she was doing. "Bradford always knows what she is doing," I said. He walked beside me for a moment in silence. In our formal diplomatic structure, he said, an apology issued on the permanent record carries a specific legal weight. It is not simply an expression of regret. It is a formal acknowledgement of being wrong, and it attaches obligations to the party that issues it. Obligations that cannot be walked back because they are in the record. I know, I said. Bradford knows too. Yes. He was quiet for another few steps. She did not ask for territory, he said slowly. She did not ask for resources or compensation or any of the things the collective was prepared to negotiate on. She asked them to admit, publicly and permanently, that they were wrong. Yes, I said. In 63 previous conflicts, he said, the collective has never been asked to do that. Because no species that had been in a conflict with the collective was ever in a position to ask. Bradford knows that too, I said. He stopped walking. He looked at me with that quiet, careful expression. She is not making demands, he said. She is giving them a choice between two kinds of cost, and she has already calculated which one they will choose. That is generally how Bradford operates, I said. We went back to the chamber. The apology negotiation took 3 days. Not because Veth-Aaron was unwilling in principle. Because language that could later be reinterpreted was not an apology in any meaningful sense. And Bradford rejected 11 drafts on exactly those grounds, each time explaining with complete precision what was insufficient and what was required. She did this without visible impatience, without repetition, without dramatizing the process. She simply returned to the table on each of those 3 mornings and explained, again, what the words needed to say. I sat in on every session. My job was translation, but Bradford had made clear in our pre-talks briefing that she also wanted me watching the VEF delegates as a whole, not just the ones speaking and noting any response that the translation software would not capture. Expressions, posture, the small communicative choices that species make without intending to, the ones that are honest precisely because they are not meant for an audience. What I saw across those 3 days was a gradual and genuine shift, not in the collective's position, which moved methodically through successive drafts, but in the way the delegates related to the process itself. On day 1, they had the quality of people enduring something unpleasant they expected to be brief. By day 2, there was something different. They were reading each draft more carefully than strictly necessary. They were discussing the language among themselves in terms that went beyond legal strategy into something more like genuine consideration of what the words meant. Bradford noticed it too. On the evening of the second day, when we were reviewing the session in a small room off the main corridor, she looked at me and said, "They're taking it seriously now, not just as a legal requirement, as a statement about what actually happened." "Yes," I said. "Good," she said. "That means draft 12 will hold." She was right. On the third day, draft 12 was accepted. The collective also announced, without being asked and without it appearing anywhere in Bradford's stated requests, a withdrawal from 3-star systems that had been considered strategic collective territory. They framed it as a gesture of goodwill toward the peace process. Bradford accepted it with appropriate grace. Price noted it in the official record without comment. I noted it in my own log with a considerable amount of personal annotation that I kept private. Those 3 systems had been on the collective's active expansion list for 40 years. They were not given up lightly. They were given up because the calculation had changed, and the calculation had changed because Sirith's message had arrived, and because 12 delegates had sat across a table from 4 humans who were not posturing or performing confidence, but simply had it, the kind that does not require demonstration because it is built from something real. On the final evening at Velar Platform, after the documents were signed and the formal record was closed, Aerith found me in the common area. She was no longer in formal attire and looked younger than she had at the table, the composed professional packaging set aside for the end of the day. She sat down across from me and was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant she was thinking about how to say something she had already decided to say. "Do your people enjoy it?" she asked. I looked at her. "Enjoy what?" "The conflict," she said. "Not the loss, not the cost, but the problem itself. The situation that cannot be solved and then is solved anyway. Do your people find something in that?" It was the question I had expected to have a fast answer to, and found I did not. I thought about it in the way it deserved. "No," I said finally. "Not exactly. I think what we find satisfying is the solving." And we are good at solving because we have spent our entire existence being presented with things that should not be solvable. I thought for another moment. The conflict is the context. What we are actually good at is refusing to accept that something cannot be done. She considered that carefully. Your history includes long periods where your people fought each other, she said, badly, and for very long stretches of time. Yes, I said, that is accurate. And yet you are still here. Yes. And when something external started the conflict, she said, you set most of that aside. Most of it, I said. We are not perfect. But shared threat produces remarkable cohesion. She nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment and then said, I voted against the pacification order. I was the only one on the full council who did. They did not listen to me. I looked at her. What was your argument? That our assessment was built on insufficient information, she said. That a species capable of reaching that region of space independently had been developing longer than we realized. That class 2 was not a conclusion, but an assumption, and a poorly supported one. She paused. I was not right about every detail, but I was right that we did not know what we were dealing with. You were right, I said. She met my eyes directly. I want to understand what we were actually dealing with, she said. Not for strategic purposes. Not to reassess a threat classification. Because I believe we were wrong about what your species is, and I would like to understand what it actually is. That is a long project, I said. I know, she said. I am prepared for that. We talked for another hour about things that were not political or strategic, just the texture of two civilizations that had tried very hard to destroy each other 3 weeks ago, and were now sitting in the same room, discovering that the distance between them was smaller than the conflict had made it appear. She told me about the collective's founding. The original 7 species had not always been aligned. 3 of the founding conflicts, she explained, had been between species that were now close partners in the diplomatic structure, their old hostilities so thoroughly converted into working relationships that most younger members of the collective did not know the history unless they sought it out deliberately. I told her that humans had a great deal of that too. The countries that were now closest allies had, at various points in history, been trying very hard to remove each other from the map. She found this both disturbing and deeply interesting, which was a combination I recognized as a healthy response. How do you hold those two things at the same time? She asked. The history of what was done and the present reality of what you have become to each other. I thought about that for a long moment because it was a real question and it deserved a real answer. You remember the history, I said. You do not let it be the only story. The past is not a justification for the present, and it is not a prediction of the future. It is information. You use it carefully. She considered that. That is a more sophisticated relationship with memory than I expected, she said. Not as a compliment exactly. As an observation. We have had a long time to develop it, I said. Dr. Wakefield joined us at some point in the second hour, pulling up a chair without being invited in the way that people who have spent decades studying other civilizations tend to do things, because they have learned that the most interesting conversations are not usually the ones you planned. He and Aerith talked directly for the better part of an hour, with me translating where the software fell short and occasionally adding context that neither of them had. Sirith came by once, looked at the 3 of us sitting together, and made a quiet observation to me and Veth that I chose not to translate immediately. Later I told Wakefield what Sirith had said. Sirith had said that he thought the meeting at Velar Platform was probably the most important thing that had happened in this region of space in a long time, and that he was glad he had been there to see it, even if the circumstances that brought him there were not what he would have chosen. Wakefield had agreed with the assessment and said he wished Sirith could have been there in a different capacity. I agree with both of them. It was not peace, not fully, not yet. Peace takes longer than talks. Peace has to be maintained and practiced and occasionally repaired and repaired again and sometimes taken apart and rebuilt from better material when the first version turns out to have weaknesses that only show under pressure. But it was something real. After everything that had happened, from the alert on my screen to the database number to Diane Cross and her gravity trick to Bradford's 4 sentences and the 11 rejected drafts of an apology, something real was more than enough to start with. 6 months after Velar Platform, I was back aboard the Carver's Promise, a mid-sized signals vessel whose name had been chosen by someone in the fleet naming committee who had a well-developed sense of irony. given that the original Carver was the mining ship whose crew had accidentally detonated a sacred monument and started everything. Nobody aboard pretended not to notice the connection. We had simply decided to treat it as appropriate. I was now technically a senior translation officer. The difference from my previous role was real, but modest. A better chair, more responsibilities that no one had formally described to me before assigning them, and a great deal more paperwork than any version of this job's description had suggested. I had also acquired, sometime in the months since Veeler, a quality of attention from people I had not met before, the way strangers at interagency meetings occasionally looked at my name badge and then at me with an expression I had not experienced before the conflict and was still getting used to. Sirith was aboard the Carver's Promise. This had not been planned exactly, but had evolved through a series of conversations and decisions made at different levels of the command structure over several months, into an arrangement that made more sense than any alternative anyone had proposed. He had formally requested asylum from Earth shortly after Veeler platform. Earth had granted it in under 24 hours, which seemed to genuinely surprise him. He had described this afterward to me as the fastest institutional decision I have ever seen your species make. And I had explained that humans made decisions very quickly when they agreed and very slowly when they did not. And in this case, everyone had agreed immediately and enthusiastically, and with several people explicitly noting that having a former Veth War Master as a resident expert was the kind of resource you did not pass up. He worked with me on translation and cultural analysis. He spent his personal hours reading and thinking. He had become, over 6 months, something that I did not have a clean word for. Not just a professional colleague. Not quite a friend in the way the term usually implied. Something in between that had its own particular weight and value. He had also developed, in those 6 months, a relationship with the concept of human coffee that I found unexpectedly moving. He had tried on his 4th day aboard and expressed moderate interest. By the end of the first week, he had opinions about the brewing method. By the end of the first month, he had strong opinions. He would not drink the machine-dispensed version under any circumstances and had specific preferences about temperature that he communicated with the same calm precision he applied to threat assessments. Owen Hartley was aboard too. He had requested the transfer himself, and Petra had signed it without asking for a justification, which was the kind of efficiency I had come to associate with Petra's management style when she had already decided she trusted someone's judgment. Owen had spent his first week on the Carver's Promise reorganizing the flight deck storage system in a way that no one had requested, but that made the space significantly more functional. He was the kind of person who could not look at a problem that was in front of him without addressing it, which made him occasionally exhausting to be around and consistently invaluable. He had also been learning Veth. Badly, in terms of pronunciation, but with a consistency of effort that Sirith had begun to treat as something between an ongoing source of low-key amusement and a genuine point of appreciation. Sirith's patience with Owen's phonemic approximations had become, over months, one of the more reliable sources of warmth on what could be a professionally demanding ship. The Carver's Promise was assigned to what the command structure called diplomatic escort duty, which was an honest description of a role that had not existed before the conflict and had been created in response to something the command staff had not initially anticipated. Other species wanted humans present. Not to impress, not to threaten, not to make any particular point. They wanted humans in the room when decisions were made, because the conflict had changed the standing calculation of what human presence meant, and nobody wanted to be on the wrong side of that calculation again. We had been to 3 different species embassies in 4 months. 2 more were being arranged. Each visit was different, but shared a common quality. People were curious about us in a way that had clearly not been the case before, and the curiosity was respectful in a way that occasionally bordered on careful. The collective's withdrawal from the 3-star systems had created a chain of reassessments much wider than those systems themselves. Other civilizations in the wider region had updated their own analyses of where humanity fit. The classification that had been settled for 11 months, the Comfortable Class 2 assessment, had been formally retired. What replaced it was something more complicated and less settled, which was, I suspected, a more accurate reflection of what we actually were. The Carver's Promise received a routine intelligence update on our 12th day of the current assignment that I read 3 times before I was satisfied I understood what it meant. 17 separate spacefaring civilizations across the region had updated their formal diplomatic classifications of humanity in the past 6 months. 15 of those updates represented improvements in standing. The remaining 2 were revisions from a prior classification that had not been negative exactly, but had been indifferent, and indifference, in diplomatic terms, is often more of an obstacle than open hostility. Petra sent me a one-line message about it from Lunar Command, where she was now serving in a senior coordination role that suited her in ways that the active command posting had not quite managed. The message said, "Told you we'd be fine." I sent back, "You knew before I did." Her reply, "That was the job." I received word on a quiet Tuesday, 3 weeks into our current assignment, that Subdelegate Aerith had been promoted. She was now Delegate Aerith, a meaningful advancement in the collective's diplomatic hierarchy, and her first formal act in the new role had been to submit a proposal for a Veth-Earth cultural exchange program to the Collective Council. I sent a congratulatory message. She responded within the hour. The message was correctly formal in its structure and its language. At the very end, separated from the formal text by a line break that made its unofficial status clear, she had written, "I have been reading your species' history, as I said I would. You were right, that is a long project. I find I am having difficulty stopping." I read the line several times. I showed it to Cirith. He read it carefully and then looked up. His expression was the one I associated with him, finding something both genuinely amusing and genuinely important at the same time. "She is the one," he said. "The one what?" I asked. "The one who will matter," he said. "When the collective finally determines what relationship it wants with your species over the long term, when the positions solidify and the policies are set, she will be the person who shapes that process. Curiosity at that level, in that position, changes the outcome of everything it touches." I thought about that. Is that what you were? Before the conflict? Curious, but not listened to. "Yes," he said. "I'm hoping she will have better circumstances." He paused. "She voted against the pacification order." "She told me," I said. He nodded. "One vote against, on a council of 12, he said. That is where things were." He looked at the message still displayed on my screen. "That is not where things are now." 2 days later, the Carver's Promise received new navigation orders redirecting us toward a station in a system that would have been considered outside the normal scope of human diplomatic operations a year ago, and now was simply the next destination on the list. The kind of change that felt unremarkable until I thought about where we had been 6 months ago and what the distance between then and now actually represented. I was reviewing the route on my console when a personal message arrived on the long-range channel, flagged with a collective identifier and addressed to my specific attention. 6 months ago, seeing a collective identifier on my communications board would have produced a very different set of feelings than it produced now. Progress is an interesting thing. It is not always visible while it is happening, and then one day you notice it by the absence of what used to be there. The message was from Delegate Aerith, not an official communication, a personal one. She was traveling to Velar platform for a follow-up session on the exchange program details, and her planned route would bring her vessel within reasonable proximity to the Carver's Promise route for a period of several days. She wrote, very carefully and with the phrasing of someone navigating unfamiliar protocol, to ask whether it would be appropriate for the 2 vessels to arrange a brief meeting while in the same region. Not official business. A continuation, she wrote, of the conversation begun in the common area at Velar platform. The one about human history and the project of understanding it. I read the message twice. Then I typed a response. "Permission granted without reservation," I wrote. "I should warn you that I have been known to discuss human history for extended periods without running low on material. If that is acceptable, we will coordinate a meeting time." Her reply arrived quickly. "I am prepared for extended periods," she wrote. "I have been preparing since Velar." I closed the channel and looked at the display showing the Carver's Promise's current position and projected course. We were moving through a region of space that was, for the first time in human history, something like a neighborhood. Not exclusively ours, not contested, just the space between one place and another, open and available and full of things we had not found yet. Cirith was at his station reading something, the quiet focus he brought to everything he considered worth his attention. Owen was at the flight deck, humming the way he always did when he was working something out, a habit that had become Over months, part of the background sound of the ship in the way that machinery sound become part of the background of a place you know well. I thought about the first morning, the alert hitting every screen red before I had finished my breakfast. Petra's laugh, the genuine one that came from somewhere real. Colin Webb's hands that were not steady when the rest of him was. The green lights rolling across my board one after another as everything we had came awake at once in the dark of the solar system. I thought about the database number that had made Cirith stop speaking for 2 days. I thought about Diane Cross in the corridors of Kepler Station, moving 43 people through a search operation they should not have survived undetected. I thought about Bradford sitting at the table at Velar Platform, asking for 4 things, and the 4th thing being the one that changed everything because it was not a resource or a territory, but a permanent admission that we had been right and they had been wrong, and you cannot take that back once it is in the record. We had not set out to become the thing that made the most powerful military coalition in the known galaxy stop its advance and recalculate. We had not wanted to prove anything or demonstrate anything. Nobody had sat in a room before any of this started and said, "Let us remind the galaxy what we are." We had just refused to stop. That was the whole of it. That was the complete explanation for every question anyone had asked about us since the first message arrived. The grid that rebuilt itself. The hidden ships. The formation that would not hold position and would not accept a defeat and would not stop adapting. The 4-person delegation that sat across from 12 and asked for an apology and got the territory as an apology gift. We had just refused to stop. A new signal came in on the long-range board while I was thinking, a routine survey report from a team working in a system 3 light years over, flagging a large rock formation with unusual mineral density readings that the team thought might be worth investigating. I pulled up the report. I cross-referenced the coordinates against every cultural and historical database we had accumulated about the region, which was considerably larger than it had been 6 months ago, because Cirith had been contributing to it, and Aerith had been sending supplementary material, and 2 other newly established contact channels had added their own context. The formation was not listed in any record as significant, but the methodology of checking had become, in the past 6 months, simply what we did now. We checked. It was not a complicated or burdensome habit. It was the kind of thing that the Carver crew had not known to do, and that we were now making sure every crew knew. I flagged the report with a standard cultural significance verification request and forwarded it to the appropriate channels with a note attached, recommending a response before any extraction work began. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing that changed what large things became. Owen looked over from his station. Aerith confirmed the meeting. "Yes," I said. He nodded. He started to say something and then apparently decided the thing he had been going to say was covered by the nod and turned back to his screen. That was one of the things I appreciated about Owen. He understood which moments were complete without additional words. Cirith did not look up from his reading. "She will ask you questions you will not have easy answers to," he said. "I know," I said. "Good," he said. "The best conversations are the ones that require honest effort." The Carver's Promise moved on through the dark, carrying its small crew and its unusual passenger and its very specific kind of stubbornness into a part of the universe that had spent 6 months adjusting to the fact that we were there and was not done adjusting, and would probably keep adjusting for a very long time. That seemed right to me. That seemed like the appropriate arrangement for a species that was not done either, that was never done, that would keep finding new places and new problems and new reasons to prove to itself, as much as to anyone watching, that stopping was not something it had learned how to do. I pulled up the route to the rendezvous point where the Carver's Promise and Aerith's vessel would briefly share the same small corner of space. 2 ships from 2 civilizations that 3 weeks of conflict and 6 months of careful work had brought from a declaration of war to the edge of something that did not have a name yet, because it was too new. I set the course. The ship followed it. Owen came off the flight deck an hour later and found me still on my console with the route displayed and nothing else on the screen. He looked at it for a moment and then looked at me. "You were thinking about something," he said. "Yes," I said. "Want to talk about it?" "I thought about that." "Do you remember," I said, "the first morning when the alert hit?" "I remember," he said. "You asked me if we were going to be okay." He was quiet for a moment. "I did," he said. "What made you ask me specifically?" I said, "You could have asked anyone." Owen thought about that with the genuine attention he gave to things that deserved it. "You were reading the message. he said. And you were not panicking. I figured if the person whose job it was to understand what the message actually said was not panicking, maybe there was a reason for that. I sat with that for a moment. I had not known, that morning, that I had been projecting calm. I had not felt calm. What I'd been was focused, and apparently from the outside those looked the same. I was scared, I said. I know, he said, but you were also doing your job. There's something steadying about that. Watching someone do their job well when everything around them is wrong. He pulled his chair over and sat beside me the way he had on day 4 of the conflict and had not fully stopped doing since. And we looked at the route display together for a while without either of us saying anything. Sirith appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, made in the specific way that he had concluded was the only correct method, and placed one in front of me and one in front of Owen and sat down in the third chair. For a few minutes, none of us spoke. Outside the viewport, the stars held their positions in the dark, patient and indifferent and vast, the way they always had and the way they always would. Between them, in the spaces that looked empty but were not, there was always something to find for anyone willing to keep looking. Sirith looked at the stars for a long moment. Then he said, quietly and without particular drama, I did not expect to be here. On this ship, Owen said. In this situation, Sirith said. Alive. Useful. With people I trust. He was quiet for another moment. I expected to be sent home in a diplomatic resolution. A formal exchange. Something tidy. I did not expect to end up somewhere that felt like the right place to be. I looked at him. Is that what this is? He looked at me evenly. Yes, he said. I believe it is. Owen drank his coffee. Sirith drank his. I drank mine and thought about all the distances we had each traveled to end up in this particular room looking at this particular stretch of dark, and about the fact that none of us had planned any of it, and all of us were here anyway. We were very willing. That had always been the point.